Well, we have reached Thursday of the Passion Week, and as quiet and uneventful as Wednesday was, Thursday is full of activity and full of importance. The day begins with Jesus sending two of his disciples to go and locate a place for them to observe the Passover meal. I think he does this intentionally because he's trying to hide the location from the rest of his disciples. He knows that Judas has already worked a deal to betray him, and he doesn't want Judas to be able to capture him there at that Last Supper. He has several things he wants to accomplish still with his disciples, and so you see that Jesus is still orchestrating and moving every detail of this last week. He does meet there that evening, Thursday evening, with his disciples, and they eat what Matthew, Mark, and Luke call the Passover meal. Now here we have an interesting point. John does not call it a Passover meal. John says it actually takes place the day before the Passover should be observed. So what do we have? Which one is right? Matthew, Mark, and Luke, or John's account? Well, many scholars debate that, but I think what we actually have is a beautiful picture. Jesus is observing a Passover meal, but he is doing it the day before Passover should be observed. We know that Passover was the meal used to commemorate Israel's salvation from Egypt. The night before they were delivered in the Exodus, they took the Passover meal. And they were supposed to remember it every year as a remembrance of the salvation that Yahweh worked on their behalf. Well, now we have Jesus instituting a Passover meal, and yet it's not the same Passover meal. It's a new Passover meal. And Jesus is commemorating it, or he's observing it the night before that salvation is to be worked on behalf of his people. The prophets tell us that there is a salvation coming from their perspective that will replace the significance of the Exodus. It will be a greater, far more significance than the salvation worked at the Exodus. And that's what's happening. Jesus is instituting a new Passover meal that we now call the Lord's Supper. And this Lord's Supper is to commemorate the salvation, the great salvation that he worked on the cross in his body and in his blood. It's a new Passover meal called the Lord's Supper. And we commemorate that even now. We proclaim the Lord's death until he comes. So Jesus observes the Passover meal there with his disciples, and then he dips the bread with Judas. He tells his disciples that someone's going to betray him. They're confused by this. He dips the bread with Judas, signifying that it is Judas who will betray him, and he tells Judas, what you're going to do, go and do quickly. So Judas leaves, goes to get his conspirators, and Jesus leaves the upper room and goes to the Garden of Gethsemane. Now, interesting, John 18 tells us that in order to get there, he's got to cross over the Kidron Valley. Well, this Thursday, would have been the day that in the temple there would have been hundreds and hundreds of sacrificial lambs, Passover lambs, sacrificed in preparation for the Passover meal. Well, Jesus has got to cross over the Kidron Valley. The Kidron Valley would have been the place where all the blood from those sacrificial lambs would have been drained down the valley, the Kidron Valley. So get this, Jesus, the Passover lamb, the one who's going to go and shed his blood for his people, he has got to cross over with his disciples this stream of blood from these sacrificial lambs. He's got to cross that blood, and he does so late in the night, Thursday night, as the sacrificial lamb goes to the slaughter. He goes to Gethsemane, the Garden of Gethsemane, where he asks his disciples to watch and pray with him. He goes a little farther with Peter, James, and John, and he asks them to continue watching and praying with him. And it's there that we see the anguish, the agony, the suffering that Jesus is beginning to endure. We see him sweat drops of blood. He's under great pressure and under great agony already, knowing what he's going to endure. It's there we see this beautiful conversation he has with the Father. He says to the Father, Father, if there's any other way, let this cup pass from me. And yet we see in his humanity his willingness to submit to the Father. He says, yet not as I will, Father, but as you will. He goes back to his disciples. His disciples have failed him. They're not able to watch and pray with him. And then we see Judas entering the garden and betray Jesus. Thursday night has bled into Friday, early Friday morning now. Judas comes into the garden and betrays Jesus with a kiss. At that, his disciples, there seems to be a little bit of an attempt to fight. Jesus rebukes them, and then upon his rebuke, the disciples flee as Jesus is arrested. Those who had professed loyalty to him just a few hours before now flee him and leave him, and he is betrayed and he is forsaken. I hope that you will read these passages again. Matthew 26, verse 17 through 56, Mark 14, 12 through 52, Luke 22, 7 through 53, and then John chapter 13 through chapter 18, verse 11. I hope that you will read these passages, drink deeply from them, and prepare your hearts for Resurrection Sunday. He is risen.